Dobra, widzowie, to oglądamy. Słuchajcie, zanim obejrzymy ten materiał, to powiem wam niesamowicie ciekawą historię. Kiedyś istniało takie forum speedrunnerskie, które się nazywało Speed Demons Archive. Ja w ogóle wtedy myślałem, że to się nazywa Speed Demons, że to chodzi o demony szybkości, a to było Speed Demos, no nie, że dema. A może teraz się nawet pomyliłem, to nie ma znaczenia. Każdy kojarzy to forum. To był pierwszy hub dla speedrunnerów. I to był moment, w którym ja w pewnym momencie na YouTubie obejrzałem filmik, który w ogóle poszedł gdzieś w miarę tak szeroko odnośnie Polaka, który speedrunował Diablo 1 w 3 albo 4 minuty. I ja wtedy pierwszy raz zetknąłem się z czymś takim jak speedrunning, bo powiedzmy takie przejście takiego Diablo w jeden wieczór było coś, o czym tak jakby myślałem, gadałem z bratem, że byłoby to tak naprawdę możliwe, że w sumie dałoby się przejść takiego Fallouta w jeden wieczór, no bo wiesz, gdzie jest ten chip do wody, prawda? Ale wtedy pierwszy raz wszedłem na tą stronę i zobaczyłem, jak duże gier ludzie w bardzo niskim czasie kończą. Pamiętam, że zaraz po Diablo 1 obejrzałem wtedy faktycznie na tej stronie film, jak koleś czarodziejką speedrunuje Diablo w 3 godziny 2. Ja sobie pomyślałem, Jezu, co za bóg szybkości. W tym momencie speedruny czarodziejką trwają 45 minut, jakby się ktoś zastanawiał, jak bardzo zostało to zminmaksowane i jak daleko poszliśmy do przodu. Dlatego bardzo często odwołuję się ogólnie do idei speedrunowania, która pokazuje, jak my jako gracze sprogresowaliśmy pod względem minmaksowania mechanik i po prostu naszego skilla. My obecnie w grach robimy rzeczy, które kiedyś wydawały się niemożliwe do zrobienia przez człowieka. My robimy rzeczy, których wcześniej nie robiły roboty, ponieważ znajdujemy jeszcze więcej mechanik, które kiedyś nawet nie były pokazane na światło dzienne. I obejrzymy sobie dzisiaj materiał odnośnie tego, że ten pierwszy taki bardzo głośny speedrun Diablo 1, który naprawdę był ogromnym kamieniem milowym ogólnie w historii speedrunowania, okazał się fejkiem. I po, nie wiem, chyba tak naprawdę 20 albo 15 latach został stworzony bardzo duży research, bardzo duży materiał odnośnie faktycznie tego, w jaki sposób został ten materiał pocięty, jak został wyreżyserowany i jak bardzo to nie jest prawda. Do tego wracamy i Jezu, speedrunowanie to naprawdę to było coś, czego jakbym wtedy nie odkrył, to nie sprawiłoby, że jestem takim graczem, jakim jestem teraz. A jeszcze zanim zaczniemy ten materiał, to oczywiście muszę przypomnieć, że ja również jestem world record holderem, ponieważ jestem trzykrotnym, nie jednokrotnym, nie dwukrotnym, trzykrotnym mistrzem świata speedrunowania Heroesów. 3 times, back to back, suko. Let's go. I w ogóle to jest coś tak ciekawe, bo ponieważ dużo tych starych gier jest skonstruowanych w bardzo podobnej formie i opowiem wam w ogóle część tej historii speedrunowej mojej, która była związana z tym, że po prostu zobaczymy, jak wyglądają czasy w Heroesach i stwierdziłem, że bez żadnego problemu to są rzeczy, które da się poprawić. I wtedy bardzo taką dużą nowinką w speedrunowaniu Diablo 2 była komenda no sound, która sprawiała, że gra nie ładowała żadnych dźwięków. A że te stare gry były zrobione na takich silnikach, że każde załadowanie dźwięku było odpowiednim czasem, tak naprawdę podczas grania w Diablo 2 bez dźwięku, które było trochę problematyczne, bo nie słyszałeś, gdzie ci dropiły jakie przedmioty, co było istotne, w szczególności jakichś ringów lub run, no to finalnie kończyłeś grę po prostu szybciej, ucinając niektóre loadingi. Ja jedną z takich właśnie metod wprowadziłem w speedrunowaniu Heroesów, no i to wam tak dodatkowo od siebie mogę powiedzieć, że sam zredefiniowałem speedrunowanie gry po 20 latach, gdzie wyprowadziłem całkowicie nową taktykę, która wcześniej nie była dostępna i możecie to sobie zobaczyć u mnie na kanale. To jest jeden z najpopularniejszych wideosów. Jak sobie wejdziecie na kanał i prześledzicie według najpopularniejszych, to zobaczycie, jak pierwszy raz za pomocą tej metody pobiliśmy rekord świata na streamie. Ale dobra, let's go.
The greatest games of all time, Diablo naturally attracted speedrunners, and in 2009, a player named Grubo performed a run that beat the game in 3 minutes and 12 seconds, with it currently holding
3 minuty 12 sekund.
For the last 15 years, this
Tak
run
to
was
wyglądało.
unbeatable, but in 2024, Dwango AC, a prominent tasser, was approached about making a tool-assisted
Jak ktoś nie
speedrun
wie,
that...
co to jest tasser, to jest Tool Assisted Speedrun, czyli to jest narzędzie, które jest robotem skonstruowanym, żeby zobaczyć, jak dużo jesteśmy w stanie osiągnąć w jakiejś grze, gdy będziemy wszystko robić frame perfect.
Beat Grubo's time. The first step that Dwango took was to try and recreate Grubo's record and then improve upon it, but at the beginning of the run, he noticed that something was very wrong. This caused players familiar with the game's code to get involved, and upon further scrutiny, more issues were identified that didn't add up. Grubo would respond to some of the questions that the investigators had after analyzing his run, but as you'll see later, these answers don't make any sense. In today's video, we'll go over everything the team found that was wrong with the run, and look at the responses from Grubo and record-keeping websites. So let's start by getting familiar with a Diablo
Let's
speedrun.
go.
Before we do that, however, we need to talk about this video's sponsor, Magicraft. Magicraft's don't stand a chance. With the official 1.0 version having just launched, and with that, let's get back to the video. Speedruns of Diablo are quite basic. You need to progress through all 16 dungeon levels, collect whatever items from enemy drops or shops that can help you, then kill Diablo. This makes for a straightforward speedrun, and in January of 2009, a player named Grubo would submit a 3-minute and 12-second run to Speed Demo's archive. Fast forward to 2024, and Dwango AC, a prominent tasser and task presenter, was approached to create a task for Diablo 1. Dwango decided to use Grubo's run as a baseline when exploring potential strategies, and it's worth noting that Grubo's run is segmented. We'll get into what that means more deeply later. For now, all you need to know is that Grubo is allowed to retry sections after load screens as many times as he wants and include the best segments in his final video. When Dwango fired up his first stream of creating a task, he was eager to see the techniques Grubo used so he could try and improve on them. But before Grubo gained control of the character, Dwango noticed something very peculiar. The very first screen you see says copyright 1996 to 2001, which indicates that the game was played on version 1.09, as that's the only version with a copyright date that goes to 2001. The problem is that in the run's description, Grubo says he used a negative health glitch, which he notes was fixed on version 1.07 and later, so having this title screen doesn't make sense. The pre-game issues don't end here, however. If we go forward one screen to the main menu, we see the version number states that version 1.00 is used. So barely 10 seconds into Grubo's speedrun and we already have...
Co jest złego w ciętych speedrunach? Wiesz co, ja wychodzę z takiego założenia, że seksu się nie przerywa, więc speedrunów też raczej nie. Oba próbujesz zawsze odhaczyć jak najszybciej, więc wydaje mi się, że ta korelacja jest tutaj istotna, nie?
Discrepancies, but these weren't the only things wrong before gameplay started. Let's look at character selection and tell me what you notice. The only audio that's present is the sound from clicking on options, but the previous screen said that this was version 1.00, so there should be music playing, as music wasn't removed from Diablo's character select screen until version 1.05. From the beginning, it's clear that different versions of the game were used to make the video, and Grubo hasn't even gained control of the character yet, which raises the question, what version was he using? And fortunately, there are two glitches he uses that can help answer this. Item duplication is a prominent glitch in Diablo, and while it was present in all versions of the game...
Wiecie, jak wygląda ten bug na duplikowanie golda? W momencie, w którym twoja postać podnosi jakiś przedmiot, zapisuje to w pamięci gry. Jeżeli w momencie podnoszenia przedmiotu z ziemi klikniesz inny przedmiot, to na ten przedmiot, który właśnie podniosłeś, taki jak mikstura, zostanie nadpisane to, co gra miała zapamiętać podczas podnoszenia go, przez co go zduplikuje, ale trzeba to zrobić w odpowiednich frame'ach.
Prior to version 1.02, it was so difficult to perform.
To jest też generalnie w ogóle mega ciekawe, ponieważ to jest jedna z tych rzeczy, które jeszcze ja na przykład przed internetem wiedziałem. To jest trik, który się jakoś bardzo mocno rozszedł wtedy po gazetach. Ja nie miałem dostępu do neta, wiedziałem, że już to tak działa w Diablo.
Almost impossible. The steps to perform it are the same across all versions. Pick up an item while the inventory is closed.
Dokładnie
then before
tak.
the game can perform the update to your inventory, you need to grab an item from your inventory. If you time it correctly, the item you're holding will become a duplicate of whatever you picked up. But there's a major issue. On version 1.00, the logic the glitch exploits is contained inside of the game's event loop that runs multiple times per frame, which means the trick is sub-frame perfect, as you'd need to perform it at precisely the right moment during the CPU cycle. In versions 1.02 and later, however, the item logic was moved to the game's main loop, which updates at 20 frames per second, making item duplication a frame-perfect trick instead of a sub-frame perfect trick. And the reason it's unlikely Grubo was using version 1.02 1.02 or earlier is because not only does he perform the trick once, he performs it twice in a row. The odds of hitting a sub-frame perfect trick like this are low, and doing it twice in a row is highly unlikely. So for this reason, the team thought that Grubo was likely using a version higher than 1.02. Which brings us to the second glitch he used, the negative health glitch. Grubo uses this glitch twice during the run, and to perform it, you need to cast Mana Shield, which directs all the damage you take to your mana pool, then get your HP to a negative number, with the Mana Shield then preventing you from dying. To get your health into the negatives, you have two options: equip an item that reduces your HP or vitality stat so it will be negative, or equip an item that increases your HP or vit stat, take damage, then remove the item. For Grubo's run, he used Naj's Puzzler, a unique staff that reduces your HP by 25, as well as Raven's Ring of the Vulture, which reduces your HP by another 22 for a total of negative 47, which is higher than his max HP. Since this was patched in version 1.07 by name, the only possible versions Grubo could have been using were earlier than this, but later than version 1.02. This gives three possible versions that the run was performed on, with the likely candidate being version 1.04 according to Ajembo, one of the investigators. But it's entirely possible one of the other versions was used as well, as there isn't enough evidence to make a concrete determination. What is concrete is that nothing matches what the title and main screen displayed for versions, but this barely scratched the surface of problems with the run, and it's time we talked about segmented runs in a bit more depth. In the early days of speedrunning, uploading a full-length video to the internet was difficult, and due to this restriction, segmented speedruns, where players play the sections between loading zones, became popular. Speed Demos Archive was the main hub of activity for speedrunning back in 2009, and it allowed users to submit runs that would be featured on the site if they met certain criteria and passed a judgment process.
Ja faktycznie tego nie przekminiłem, że wtedy nagrywanie czegoś dwugodzinnego było problematyczne, więc segmentowało się.
SDA allowed for segmented runs was that players could retry each segment by reloading their save as much as they wanted, which meant that for segmented speedruns, splicing was allowed. This is where you create a video in editing software from the various segments you've recorded, but due to this allowance, segmented runs faced heavier scrutiny and had extra rules for submission. That being said, just because you're allowed to splice in a segmented run doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. And Grubo's run had various problems that related to where he spliced and
dobra, jak na razie mamy opcję.
When it comes to creating a segmented run, you're supposed to include all of the...
Podsumujmy, co mamy do tej pory. Nieścisłość, jeśli chodzi o wersję. Ej, w ogóle te health globy i mana globy z Diablo 1 są tak ikoniczne. Kurwa, to są chyba najładniejsze globy, które kiedykolwiek zrobiono, wiecie? Chłopie, ten anioł i ten demon, one tak fantastycznie wyglądają. Ten interfejs jest genialny.
Gameplay in each segment, but if we look at Grubo's run where he takes a town portal into the dungeon, the portal's animation after the loading screen doesn't start from its first frame. Instead, the animation begins on its fourth frame. This wasn't the only spot missing gameplay was observed, as at 3:28, when he uses the teleport spell, 2 frames of the animation are missing, as it only takes 3 frames before moving to the next part of the animation when it should take 5. The red town portal could be explained by bad splicing, but the frames missing from the teleport occurred just after a splice would have happened, so it doesn't make a lot of sense for these to be missing. And if we look at another instance of missing gameplay, we might get an answer to what's happening. Here's Grubo's sorcerer turning around. If you look closely, it's a total of 2 frames, but if we look at recreation footage the investigators made, this action should take 3 frames, with Grubo's animation missing the middle frame. In other parts of the run, the team also noticed frames that were missing or had been duplicated, and their determination was that these missing or duplicated frames were likely due to the encoder used when the video was uploaded, which makes the analysis of this run a lot more difficult. While the movement animation and teleport can be explained by the encoder, there's one section of the run that the encoder doesn't explain, and that's his interactions with Adria while buying items. Grubo sells off his duplicated items, then purchases some potions and spells, but what's interesting is how he refreshes the shop inventory. In versions 1.02 and earlier, you need to walk to the dungeon, then go back to town to refresh the items at a shop. But Grubo doesn't do this. Instead, he talks to the shopkeeper again. In a conversation with Dwango, Grubo says that he used the save and load method, but he didn't include the menu action because it's a 1-frame input and it made for a better viewing experience. Since Grubo refreshed the shop 3 times, his run should...
Faktycznie, no, jedna klatka by ci viewer experience totalnie zniszczyła. Czyli wyciął sobie część rana. No i jelo.
Only be missing a 15th of a second, but when the team recreated his shopping sequence using a task, there was a total of 1.7 seconds that were missing, as Grubo didn't include the time after the loading screens, and according to the SDA rules at the time, these should have been included. On top of this, listen to this sequence and tell me if you notice anything peculiar.
I sense a soul in search of answers.
If you didn't catch it, the music skips when Grubo talks to Adria, which isn't something that happens normally. And when the team put the audio under a spectrogram, you can see a noticeable cut before Adria's dialogue.
Jezu, jak ja uwielbiam takie speedruny, które są czemuś takiemu poddawane.
Starts, which indicates a splice. In segmented runs, splices are only allowed under two circumstances, between loading sections and during a save and quit, not during gameplay itself, but this wasn't the only instance of where splicing was thought to have been used in the run. On dungeon level 4, Grubo picks up a Ring of the Vulture, one of the items he'll use later to perform the negative health glitch, but if we go forward to the next time he opens the inventory, we'll see that the ring is nowhere to be found. This is a cause for concern, because at 155, he opens his inventory and drops the ring, so somehow the ring was picked up, disappeared, then found its way back to his inventory, which seems to indicate that the clip he used when he opened his inventory wasn't part of the same playthrough. At this point, nothing was adding up, and as the team looked deeper, things only became more bizarre. If we look at the dungeon layouts Grubo encountered, you might notice something. Almost all of them have the stairs to the next level proximate to the stairs he just came down. You might be thinking that this isn't a problem or a cause for suspicion, as Grubo can reset these segments and just roll new dungeon
takie
layouts,
rzeczy to,
but this isn't
kurwa, każdy, kto grał w Diablo, to wie, że takie rzeczy się nie dzieją, nie? To ja nie wiem, ile razy by to musiało być pocięte.
How RNG works in Diablo when it comes to dungeon layouts. When you create a character, the game generates an initial RNG seed, and from that seed, it generates 16 dungeon seeds. So from the time of character creation, the layout for every dungeon is already set. This means that once you're in a game...
Dokładnie, kurwa, dokładnie. To ja wam wytłumaczę, o co chodzi. Patrzcie, tworzycie sobie grę, no nie? Tu jest wasza postać i w tej grze Dungeon 1 wygląda tak, powiedzmy. No nie? I Dungeon 2 wygląda tak. I jeżeli wy przejdziecie pierwszy dungeon, prawda? I zapiszecie grę i wczytacie, to ten drugi dungeon będzie zawsze identyczny, bo to jest stworzone już na samym początku rana. I trzeci dungeon, powiedzmy, będzie kółkiem. I on zawsze będzie kółkiem. Nieważne ile razy wy zapiszecie, nieważne ile razy wy wczytacie. Więc to, co on robił, słuchajcie, to on stworzył sobie save postaci, przeszedł przez pierwszy dungeon, który mu się wygenerował taki, jaki chciał, i potem wszedł na drugi poziom i stworzył kolejne postacie, które miały identyczny poziom drugi, jaki potrzebował. I potem, jak już był loading na trzeci poziom, to on musiał znowu tworzyć postacie, gdzie trzeci poziom będzie identyczny jak poprzedni, żeby miał od razu wejście pod sobą. Ale te poprzednie poziomy już nie były takie, jak pokazał na wideo, bo tego się nie da tak po prostu tworzyć. Nie możesz stworzyć poziomu w Diablo w taki sposób, to ci się nie może tak wylosować, że ty będziesz miał 15 zejść obok siebie z rzędu. To były godziny roboty. On za każdym razem musiał tworzyć nową postać, przechodzić przez wszystkie poprzednie poziomy i sprawdzać, czy następne zejście jest tam, gdzie by chciał, no nie? Kurwa, szybciej by zrobił tego speedruna, jak najbardziej.
It's impossible to change what dungeon layout you'll get unless you're using external modifications or splicing together segments from different save files. To determine if the dungeon layouts in Grubo's run were actually
Czyli
legit,
pyk? I to już jest nowa postać, to jest już zupełnie nowy save, nie?
the team reverse engineered his initial dungeon seed. So let's take a quick look at how RNG is created in Diablo
I to jest
and
jeszcze
look at
inna
the methodology
postać.
the team used for evaluating Grubo's seeds. To create randomness, Diablo uses a pseudo-random number generator called a linear congruential generator. The way Diablo implements this results in 4.2 billion numbers, which means there are 4.2 billion possible seeds. But due to it converting the negative numbers to positive, it ends up being 2.1 billion possible seeds. A good way to
2 miliardy możliwych, słuchajcie, możliwości.
understand how this works is to imagine every possible number in a line, then to shuffle them. But the key here is that it can't arbitrarily randomize these numbers, it can only generate seeds that exist as part of the line. To generate a starting seed, the game takes the number of seconds that have passed since midnight on January 1st, 1970, then uses that number as the starting point in the shuffle.
To też jest generalnie ciekawe. To słuchajcie, też jest ciekawe, bo w ogóle randomowość w Diablo 1 jest przypisana do daty waszego systemu. I w konkretnych miesiącach w Diablo 1 dropią inne przedmioty. Jeżeli na przykład chcecie pobijać world record, to powiedzmy world recordy najlepiej się pobija w lutym w Diablo 1. I to totalnie, mówię wam, bez przypału, ale możecie sobie zmienić po prostu w systemie, wiecie, datę jaką macie, bo to szczytuje z datę z systemu. Jeżeli powiedzmy w speedrunie Diablo 1 jeden z najważniejszych przedmiotów to jest księga Firewalla. I ona ma w konkretnym miesiącu największą szansę na drop. Naprawdę, tak jest. No bo komputery nie są w stanie otworzyć randomowości, więc zawsze tą randomowość trzeba było odwoływać do czegoś. A co jest większą zmienną u nas na komputerze niż tak naprawdę czas, płynący tam od 1970 roku. Wiadomo, to trwa w jednej pętli cały czas, no ale tak jakby, no każdy gameplay będzie inny, no bo nigdy nie zabijesz tego samego moba o tej samej godzinie, tego samego dnia. To jest niesamowite. Jest w ogóle polski kanał taki, w ogóle jeden z Polaków posiada world record w speedrunowaniu Diablo 1, Krzysiek komentator, i on w ogóle streamuje, on streamuje po angielsku, ostatnio dawno nie streamował, ale możecie sobie zobaczyć jego kanał, jego speedruny, i on też kilka razy o tym mówi. On na przykład nie korzysta z tego, ale jeżeli ktoś chciałby tak typowo nastawić się na grindowanie world recordu z najlepszym możliwym RNG, jaki by mógł mieć, no to trzeba grać wtedy w Diablo z ustawioną konkretną datą systemu.
Line. And since the equation is deterministic, with a few pieces of information, you can reverse engineer a starting seed. However, this isn't as simple as crunching numbers. To find a seed, the team needed to create one-to-one matches of the dungeon levels in Grubo's run on a map editor, then feed them into the Diablo map generator, where it's then matched to every possible dungeon seed with the pattern you've given it. This provides matches to a handful of layouts, and from there, it's a matter of taking these layouts and comparing the monster and object placement on them to find the seed that lines up with what was observed in Grubo's game. So how do we know this process is accurate? Not only was a decomp performed on Diablo to reverse engineer the code, but the source code itself is also available. And in 2019, the decomp code was worked on to become a one-to-one function binary match with the source code. For these reasons, we know the tools created to analyze the dungeon and starting seeds are accurate and produce correct results, with the process giving the team the dungeon seed, the game seed, and the starting time required to produce the seed. To check Grubo's seeds, they first tested them in Devolution X, a port of Diablo that allows for modding, and then cross-checked these seeds in the vanilla game by setting their system clock to the appropriate time. So let's see what their analysis provided. When generating a game, one dungeon seed in particular has a special job, and that's level 15, as it's also used to determine which quests will be active. Quests exist in groups, with one quest per group randomly getting turned off for each new game, except for the quests in Group 6. And to decide which are turned off, values from the dungeon seed for level 15 are used. Because of this, you'll never see the Poison Water Supply or Skeleton King active in the same game, but in Grubo's run, both quests are observed. When he returns to Tristram for the first time,
no to potwierdza to, co mówiłem na samym początku. To za każdym razem była inna postać.
Indicating that the Poisoned Well quest is inactive. But when the team looked at some of his dungeon seeds, they indicated that the quest should have been active. When they identified Grubo's dungeon level 2, they looked at the off-screen parts of the map, and it contained the Butcher's Room and a hole in the wall. The hole in the wall is significant because it leads to the end of the Poisoned Water Supply quest, and only appears in games where the quest is active. So in this case, we have a dungeon seed that says the quest should be active, but later in the game, the visual indicator of this quest is missing, as the well water is blue instead of yellow. But this isn't the only quest that had issues. If we look at Grubo's dungeon level 4, we see that the stairs down to level 5 are open. But if Ogden's quest was active, they would be blocked by an enemy named Snotspill, meaning that the quest isn't active. However, when the team looked at Grubo's other dungeon seeds, specifically Dungeon Seed 15, they indicated the quest should have been active. This same issue was observed with the Warlord of Blood quest, and another oddity happened with with Group 3 quests, as some seeds had Magic Rock being set to inactive, while others showed Halls of the Blind as inactive, which is impossible since only one quest per group can be inactive when a game is generated. There were only two explanations for how this happened. Either Grubo modified his seed generation with a memory editor or other tool to get favorable seeds, which led to the discrepancies, or the entire run was spliced from different games, and if we look at the seeds the team identified, we'll start to get a clear picture of what happened. Here's the full list of dungeon seeds that the team found in Grubo's run, and we'll get to why 3 and 4 are empty in a bit. For each dungeon seed, the team identified them by creating them in the level editor in the process described above, then was able to get the game seed from that information, which also led to them finding the exact start time required to produce those seeds.
O, i zobaczcie, jak w 2008 roku, 24 grudnia o 18:48 26 sekund wystartujecie nową grę, to dostaniecie ten seed pierwszego poziomu, który on właśnie dostał. Niesamowite to jest, nie? I zobaczcie teraz, że to jest wszystko w jakichś innych datach wytworzone, no?
Looking at the start times, these all line up with the timeline that Grubo was working on the run, as it was submitted on January 16th, just a few weeks later. When it comes to the dungeon seeds, only 2 of them were from the same game, 7 and 8, with the others all coming from different starting seeds, which means they were all likely spliced from different playthroughs. So what about dungeon levels 3 and 4? When the maps were analyzed, only partial matches were found. No seed returned a perfect match for the tile pattern in Grubo's run. But dungeon level 9 also had an issue. The only matches for its game seed were invalid, so you might be wondering, what's an invalid seed? There are 2 different types of invalid seeds, those that violate seed generation rules and those that have an invalid start time. An example of a seed that violates generation rules would be one that uses a dungeon layout specific.
Nie no, generalnie przyznać trzeba mu jedno. Typ zajebiście pociął ten run, jeśli chodzi o wytworzenie speedrunu. Zobaczcie, że jak na razie wszystko się zgadza. Ciekawe, czy wejdzie tu jakieś hakowanie w grę. No bo on musiał mieć bardzo dużą wiedzę na temat tej gry, żeby tak spreparować run. No miał chłop łeb, typ miał giga łeb do tego, trzeba przyznać.
But the quest is inactive, as you'll never see a layout for the
Ej, musimy więcej takich rzeczy ze speedrunów poglądać, że strasznie kurwa lubię speedruny, no nie? Ostatnio też oglądaliśmy jakiś materiał o speedrunach i mówiłem to samo i skończyło się tak, że przez pół roku nic nie obejrzeliśmy.
Quest is active. Seeds with an invalid start time are different, however, because Diablo uses the time in seconds beginning from 1970 as its RNG starting point. It suffers from the 2038 problem. The data structure used to store the number of seconds has a limit, and will reach its maximum in the year 2038 if it keeps...
Ty, no to Diablo macie jeszcze tylko 14 lat na ogrywanie Diablo 1, bo po tym roku będzie glitchowała się logika tej gry. Ty, nawet nie miałem pojęcia. Co ty gadasz?
Counting, it will overflow and start giving negative numbers. To combat this problem, Diablo is coded so that games started outside of this range are all the same, but when the team investigated Grubo's seeds, they expanded the range to go for decades beyond the limit, and tweaked it so that impossible quest layouts were included as well, referring to these seeds as invalid. And if we look at Grubo's seed for level 9, we might get some insight into why 3 and 4 were missing. While 2 matches for level 9 were found, the seeds had start times in 2056 and 2074, which isn't possible due to how the 2038 problem was handled, meaning these seeds can't be reached without modifications. But this wasn't the only problem with level 9. A key item drops for Grubo here, Naj's Puzzler, as it allows him to teleport, activate the negative health glitch, and it's duplicated so he can sell it for gold. But in the 2 seeds the team found that match Grubo's level 9 layout, the lava board that drops this item shouldn't drop it according to the game seed, which points to some...
Pomyślcie teraz, że w tej grze, dlatego na przykład nikt nie robi Holy Graili z Diablo 1, bo to jest tak dziwnie przypisane do dat, do seedów. Jeżeli chciałbyś faktycznie dropić jakieś przedmioty, to musiałbyś to robić w konkretne dni, albo sprawdzać, jakich przedmiotów ci brakuje i wtedy to faktycznie jakoś podmieniać. I teraz zobaczcie, że na tym layoutie ten mob nie może wydropić konkretnego przedmiotu.
Form of external manipulation being used for the item drop. For dungeon levels 3 and 4, the team did find some seeds that had a similar layout, but an exact match down to the tile couldn't be identified, and they note that levels 3, 4, and 9 are the only levels that Grubo picks up any items on, which made them think that there was some correlation between item manipulation and level generation. Item drops and monster spawns are also determined determined when you create your character, which means there's no way to manipulate what enemies you'll encounter or what they'll drop, and Grubo even acknowledges this. If we look at his 2007 Diablo submission, he says that you can't manipulate item drops because they're generated upon character creation. So he was aware of how drops were handled, but if we look at his 2009 submission, he says that with extensive research, he figured out how to manipulate what monster drops appear and where. To date, the team is unaware of any methods of manipulating RNG aside from starting the game from a new character. As your game seed, dungeon seeds, quests, and item drops are all set at that moment. This leaves us with what the
kurwa, ten materiał jest genialny.
Said about Grubo's submission, Grubo's response to all of this, and the biggest piece of evidence that suggests something is more than fishy. If we look at the SDA rules that Grubo was submitting under using the Wayback Machine, we see that there is an allowance for games that let you save and continue to be submitted using segments. However, there are timing requirements for segmented runs, specifically around games that let you save anywhere like Diablo, as any time you save the game yourself, a half-second penalty is applied to your run instead of counting the time spent menuing, and when loading, the timing resumes when the game finishes loading. This explains why Grubo's shopping section was significantly faster than it should have been, as he shouldn't have edited out the time after the load when the screen was fading in. But given that English isn't his first language, it is possible he misunderstood the rules around this point. However, it is implied in this rule that segments are to be done from the same save file, or that
kurwa, coś takiego to chyba naprawdę tylko Polak był w stanie ogarnąć, nie?
if you are using different save files, the continuity needs to be the same. And if we look at other runs from this time period, we see that they were rejected for the same issues that have been flagged in Grubo's run. Looking at a Dead Space submission from June 1st of 2009, about 5 months after Grubo's submission, we see that it was rejected because when the runner finished Part 5, they had no health upgrades, but when they started Part 6, their character had multiple health upgrades, before they disappeared again in Part 7. The runner admitted that for Part 6, they used a different save game to perform that segment, and for this reason,
to nie jest segmentowanie na różnych
According to the
postaciach.
rules at the time, Grubo's run should have been
Ty, to może ja wkleję jakiś... Nie no, przecież te segmentowane rany tak słuchajcie, przykłamywane. To jest literalnie jakbyś wkleił, że zaczynasz paladynem, wychodzisz z gry, wchodzisz na czarodziejce przed balem, nie? No i jessa.
disqualified due to the multiple versions being used
tak, no,
and
to jest
the
ten
injury
run
rate changing inexplainably. But since this was missed in verification, it made it onto the website, which brings us to Grubo's response. Late in the investigation, when they were formalizing the final report, the team were able to make contact with Grubo, and one of the things he took issue with was their methodology when they identified his game seeds. His first point of contention is that the team puts too much stock into how dungeons are generated and that nothing else could have an effect on them. But as we've already discussed, the team knows exactly how and in what way dungeon layouts are created and populated, as not only do they have a highly accurate decomp, but they also have the source code to work from. And Grubo's seeds were tested both in the modded version of the game and original release. His second issue is with the narrow scope of the seeds the team analyzed, as they only included in the report seeds that matched a narrow range of dates, and that the actual number of seeds is massive. This is a point I was curious about as well, so I asked the team what range of seeds they looked at and how they went about identifying these seeds, and this was their response. To find all possible seeds, they didn't just look at valid seeds that were within the range of the 2038 problem, they expanded the search to look at seeds that could be generated after 2038 using the same methodology. This is a large task that takes a lot of computing power, so they scanned decades of seeds over the span of a week using 30 2-core workstations and a 140-core server to handle the computational load. Once the searching was finished, they did find other seeds that matched Grubo's run. For example, Efatha showed me this document that found seeds for level 7 and level 8. For level 7, one seed was started on December 24th of 2008, and another required a start date in 2075. And for level 8, one seed started again in December of 2008, while another would have started in 1994. Since the team knew seeds after 2038 aren't possible without external modification, and they were getting lots of hits around the date Grubo would have been making the run, they chose to focus on the seeds that were grouped around the 2008 2008 dates. It's also worth noting that in talking with Grubo, he never said that he searched for seeds at specific dates by changing his clock, just that the run was created over months of manually looking for seeds by starting games. At this point, SDA reached out to Grubo as well, and during their correspondence, he told them that the head admin at the time, Mike Uyama, told him that for his run, it would be okay if he created it from different save files. I reached out to Mike and he couldn't remember anything about this run given that it happened 15 years ago. But even if we take Grubo's word as fact, it doesn't explain the missing gameplay from splices such as the red portal, or how Naja's puzzler dropped from the lava lord on that specific dungeon seed, which leaves us with the final piece of evidence, the fight with Diablo. This part of the analysis wasn't performed until the investigation was almost finished, and I'd like to thank Dwango AC, Ajembo, Staffin, Ephatha, K-Phoenix, Kevins, and Funkmaster MP, not just for taking the better part of 8 months to perform the investigation, but also for helping with this video, and what they did with the Diablo fight is truly a work of art. To evaluate the validity of Grubo's Diablo fight, they decided to recreate it in a TAS, and in a normal difficulty game, Diablo has 833 HP, so the first thing the team did was calculate what level Grubo's character was, which turned out not to be as easy as you may think. Grubo only shows his character page once, and it's when he's level 3, so the team had to calculate what his level was based off the enemies he killed. This sounds simple enough, except in the Lazarus fight, there's the possibility that he killed off-screen enemies, so a spreadsheet was created that gave a level range based on the enemies he may have killed, which gave Grubo a level range between 12 and 13. To narrow his level down even further, they observed his mana globe while casting fireballs and created a character with the same gear as Grubo's and tested it at different levels until they found a mana consumption rate that matched, with a level 12 character being a perfect fit. This left the damage range on Fireball itself. Here's the formula for how much damage a Fireball can do, and since Grubo's Fireball was level 3, this gives it a possible damage range of 38 to 91. But since Diablo has a 75% fire resistance, the range is actually this. Additionally, there's also a quirk with Fireball where the target it hits will take damage from collision and then again from the splash damage. So after the reduction, the range will be 19 to 45.5 if Diablo is the
Dlatego Fireball jest taki silny, bo on double hituje.
This means the minimum number of fireballs you can kill him in is 20, and that's assuming none miss and they all do max damage. Once the math was figured out, the team needed to recreate the fight, so they took Grubo's dungeon seed for level 16 and used some tools that allowed them to perfectly match his RNG, which meant that monsters would behave in the same way in the TAS as they did in his run, but what they observed baffled them. For the first second and a half, the TAS was a perfect match, but after that, it desynced with the monsters behaving differently. On top of this, the TAS wasn't able to kill Diablo. In fact, the character died after running out of mana, suggesting to the team that the Fireball wasn't doing enough damage. Through trial and error, they began adjusting the Fireball damage, and when the damage range was 78 to 129, the TAS synced perfectly with Grubo's fight. This range is equivalent to a level 26 sorcerer using a level 3 fireball, which can only be achieved by killing almost every enemy in the game.
Co ty gadasz, że on kurwa... On totalnie jakoś postać dolevelował w międzyczasie?
Another interesting thing about this fight.
A nie, nie dolevelował postaci, bo miał cały czas ten sam mana consumption. On miał zedytowanego save'a, gdzie Fireball zadaje więcej damage'a. Nie, faktycznie, jak on tyle czasu poświęcił na to, żeby poprzednie rzeczy sfejkować, to czemu tutaj? Dobrze mówisz, że kraść to miliony.
Fireballs, and if you add up that many max damage fireballs, you'll get just enough damage to kill Diablo. However, 19 fireballs won't kill Diablo in the game due to his health regen. The real number of max damage fireballs you'd need would be 20, with the team assuming that Grubo forgot to add in health regen when he did his calculation. When speaking with Matan, an admin for Speed Demos Archive, Grubo said that in his testing, he did notice Diablo dying in less fireballs than he had in his run, but he never used this footage. And interestingly, he says later that he used a hero editor, but only to set his character's inventory and stats between save games for segments, and to use teleport to quickly scout seeds. He said the same thing to Dwango as well, that he only used the hero editor to make his character consistent between games, and that in his testing, he recalled Diablo...
Po co on w ogóle im odpowiada? Przecież on sam na siebie białko kurwa podał.
dying in less fireballs than his calculations said he should. Dwango pressed him on if SDA had given him an exception for using the hero editor, with Grubo replying that he never asked since he only used it for research and it wasn't present in his segments. Given that the TAS only matched Grubo's Diablo fight when the fireball was buffed to that of a level 26 sorcerer, I'll leave it up to you to decide what was going on here and if foul play was involved, so let me know down below. One thing I will say is that Grubo repeatedly made the assertion that his run was segmented and never broke any of the rules at the time. He even goes on to say that runs having to be performed from a single save file were rules that were only applied to TAS or RTA runs at the time, and not segmented runs. But even if all of that is granted, the run still had continuity problems as there was a splice before Adria that shouldn't be present, the inventory changed inexplicably throughout the run, and most importantly, the Diablo fight couldn't be recreated with a TAS that matched his RNG. Which leaves two questions. What was the response from Speed Demos Archive and Guinness World Records after the report was published? Dwango presented the team's findings in a talk at DEF CON, which I highly encourage everyone to watch. And not long after that, SDA released an update on their front page going over the discrepancies the team found. Due to the multiple versions used, the team being unable to reproduce areas of the run with TAS, the problems with multiple dungeon levels, and the Diablo fight only being replicated with a modified fireball, SDA made the decision to remove not just this run, but Grubo's other Diablo runs as well. Dwango has contacted Guinness as Grubo's run was used to claim 2 world records, one for the fastest completion of Diablo and another for the fastest completion of an
Ej, do Guinness Rekordu się można zgłosić czymś takim? Ja pierdolę, czemu ja się nie zgłosiłem do tego, żeby z Heroesami mieć World Record w Guinness? Ja pierdolę. Ty, to chyba trzeba wrócić do Ile kosztuje zgłoszenie się do Guinnessa? Może faktycznie, kurwa, zgłoszy się do Guinnessa.
RPG.
10 koła trzeba dać. No i właśnie, kurwa, to nie ma sensu. Dla dyplomu nie ma sensu.
Video game. It's not known if Grubo submitted these runs or someone else did, as he never answered this question when he was asked, and at the time of this video, Guinness have yet to reply. This has been one of the more unique cheating scandals I've ever seen, and to end the video, I'd like to share a rhyme. Not even death can save you from me, and I'll see you in the next episode of Abyss Soft Z.
Zajebiste wideo. Zajebiste wideo. Dobre fest. No.